Look at a map of the Middle East, and you will see Iran sitting right next to Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. Same sun, same dust, same broad region that textbooks have lumped together for generations under a single label, Middle Eastern. And for most of the 20th century, that label carried an unspoken genetic assumption that the people living across this region were, more or less, drawn from the same ancient pool. Close neighbors, shared ancestry, minor variations at most. That assumption is wrong, and not wrong by a small margin. The genetic divergence between Iranians and their Arab neighbors does not trace back centuries, or even a few thousand years. It traces back tens of thousands of years to a split so ancient that by the time the first farmers planted seeds in this region, the two populations had already been separated for longer than the entire history of civilization. The question is not just why they are different. The question is why it took us so long to see it. To understand why that took so long, you have to understand what scientists believed before the DNA spoke. For most of the 20th century, population genetics in the Middle East ran on a simple model. The Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the Levant through Mesopotamia and into the foothills of Iran, was understood as the birthplace of agriculture. One origin, one event, one population that learned to farm and then spread outward. The logic was intuitive. These regions are geographically connected. The crops overlap. The archaeological timelines overlap. Why would anyone assume that two completely separate groups of people invented farming independently in the same broad region at almost the same time? And so for decades, the default position was a single origin model. Farming started somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, probably the Levant, and the people who invented it carried their genes outward with their grain, into Anatolia, into Europe, into Iran. One migration, one founding population, one genetic signature that gradually diluted as it moved. There was evidence supporting this. Radiocarbon dates from Levantine sites like Jericho and Abu Huraira showed early domestication of wheat and barley by around 11,500 years ago. The Zagros foothills showed early goat management by around 10,200 years ago, close enough in time that a single-wave model seemed plausible. The Y chromosome haplogroup J, present across both regions, appeared to confirm a shared paternal ancestry. Everything fit, as long as you did not look too closely. But here is where the assumption started to function as a wall. When researchers studied modern Middle Eastern populations using limited genetic markers, they were working with a narrow lens. A Y chromosome haplogroup tells you about one lineage, the paternal line, inherited across thousands of years. Mitochondrial DNA traces one maternal line. These are powerful tools, but they are like reading a single sentence from a 1,000-page book and assuming you know the plot. The broader genome, hundreds of thousands of variable positions across 23 pairs of chromosomes, remained unread. And that matters because the Middle East was not one story. It was at least two, running in parallel, separated by a wall of stone. The Zagros Mountains run for roughly 1,500 kilometers along Iran's western edge, with peaks exceeding 4,000 meters. East of the Zagros, the Iranian Plateau opens into the Dasht-e-Kavir and Dasht-e-Lut, two of the most inhospitable deserts on Earth. Together, these form a geographic barrier that most people underestimate. From the Levantine coast to the Iranian interior, you do not cross open ground. You cross a fortress. And it was this fortress that preserved a separation far older than anyone expected. The crack in the old model appeared quietly in a university lab around 2016. Farnaz Brushaki and a team of researchers extracted ancient DNA from the remains of a Neolithic woman buried at Ganj Dareh, a site in the central Zagros Mountains of Iran. The site dates to approximately 10,000 years before present, a period when the people there were among the earliest goat herders on Earth. Brushaki's team sequenced her genome at 1.39 times coverage, enough to build a portrait of her ancestry. When I first read that study, I expected it to confirm the single origin model. It did the opposite. The Ganj Dare woman belonged to a population that was neither ancestral to the first European farmers, nor had contributed substantially to the ancestry of modern Europeans. She was not a branch of the Levantine family tree. She was from a different tree entirely. The same year, Iosif Lazaridis and colleagues at Harvard published a landmark study in Nature, analyzing 44 ancient genomes from across the Near East, spanning roughly 12,000 to 1,400 years before the Common Era. The data revealed something that reshapes how you have to think about this entire region. When Lazaridis plotted the ancient genomes on a principal component analysis, the Neolithic populations from the Zagros and the Neolithic populations from the Levant did not cluster together. They sat in separate quadrants of the genetic map. Two distinct ancestral pools, farming in the same broad region at roughly the same time, yet genetically as different from each other as either was from European hunter-gatherers. If you have been following this channel, you know that ancient DNA has overturned more consensus models in the last decade than in the previous century combined. But this one hits differently, because the estimated divergence date between these two populations is staggering. Brushaki's team calculated that the Zagros Neolithic population and the Anatolian Neolithic population had separated somewhere between 46,000 and 77,000 years ago. Let that sit for a moment. The people farming goats in Iran and the people farming wheat in the Levant had been genetically separated for longer than the entire Upper Paleolithic. They were not relatives who drifted apart. They were populations that had been on different paths since before the last ice age reached its peak. Before we get into what this means for modern Iranians and Arabs, if this kind of evidence-driven storytelling is something you value, subscribe so you do not miss the next one, because the next layer of this gets even more revealing. Now, imagine plotting this onto living populations. You take DNA from modern Iranians, particularly Iranian Zoroastrians, who represent the least admixed descendants of the pre-Islamic population, and you run the same principal component analysis. Their genomes pull toward the ancient Zagros cluster. Not vaguely, not approximately. They sit in the same quadrant as the 10,000-year-old Ganj Dare woman. The thread is direct. 100 centuries of ancestry, still visible in the genome today. Then you plot modern Arab populations, particularly those of the Arabian Peninsula. Their genomes pull in the opposite direction, toward the Levantine Neolithic lineage, the same lineage that spread farming westward into Anatolia and eventually into Europe. Y chromosome data makes this vivid at the individual level. In Yemen and parts of Saudi Arabia, haplogroup J1M267 reaches frequencies of 40 to 70%. This lineage is strongly associated with Levantine and Arabian paternal ancestry, tracing back to expansions that began in the Levant roughly 11,000 years ago. In Iran, J1 drops dramatically. Instead, J2M172, a lineage concentrated in the Zagros Caucasus arc, rises to 20 to 30%. And the maternal lines tell the same story. Mitochondrial haplogroups U7 and HV appear at elevated frequencies across Iran, but remain rare in Arab populations. Two completely independent inheritance systems, paternal and maternal, both pointing to the same ancient separation. Now, here is what this pattern rules out. Random drift does not produce this signature. If these populations had shared a recent common ancestor and simply diverged through isolation, you would see a gradient, a smooth transition from one genetic profile to the other. You do not see a gradient. You see a boundary. Principal component analysis, which compresses the entire genome into its most informative axes, consistently separates Iranian and Arab populations on the first two components. That means the most significant source of genetic variation in the region is the Iranian-Arab split. Not latitude, not longitude, not modern borders, ancestry. And what it implies is that the Fertile Crescent was never one cradle. It was two. Two populations, independently developing food production strategies, separated by mountains and desert, carrying genetic signatures that would persist through every empire, every conquest, every migration for the next 10 millennia. I think this might be the most underappreciated finding in Middle Eastern population genetics, because it does not just change the story of Iran and the Arab world, it changes the story of farming itself. Two independent inventions of agriculture, separated by a mountain range, by populations who had been strangers since the Paleolithic. But the Zagros split is only half the answer, because something else arrived on the Iranian Plateau that Arabs never received. Around 2,000 to 1,500 years before the Common Era, a new genetic signal appears in Iranian ancient DNA. Steppe ancestry. Populations from the Parthian-Caspian steppe, carrying haplogroup R1a and a distinct genetic profile associated with early Indo-European speaking groups, migrated southward. Today, roughly 16% of Iranian males carry R1a. In Arab populations, this haplogroup is almost entirely absent. This is the genetic signature of the Indo-Iranian migration, the movement that brought the ancestors of the Persians, Medes, and other Iranian-speaking peoples onto the plateau. So modern Iranians are not simply Zagros farmers who stayed put. They are a composite, an ancient Zagros Neolithic base, overlaid with Bronze Age steppe pastoralist ancestry, with minor Levantine and Caucasus input. Modern Arabs, by contrast, carry that Levantine Neolithic base overlaid with varying degrees of African ancestry, particularly in the southern Arabian Peninsula, and later Levantine and Mesopotamian admixture. Honestly, this is the part I find hardest to wrap my head around. These populations lived in neighboring regions for 10,000 years. Empires rose and fell across both territories: the Achaemenids, the Abbasids, the Mongols. The Islamic conquests of the 7th century brought Arabic language and religion deep into Iran. And yet, the genetic data from a 2024 study analyzing 50 ancient samples across 9 Iranian sites shows 3,000 years of genetic continuity on the northern Iranian plateau, from the Copper Age through the Sassanid Empire. Conquest changed language. It changed religion. It changed architecture and literature. But it barely changed the genome. There is still genuine debate, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Some researchers argue the steppe contribution to Iran is significantly higher than current models suggest, because ancient DNA sampling from eastern Iran remains frustratingly sparse. We have good coverage of the Zagros foothills and a few central plateau sites, but vast stretches of Khorasan, Sistan, and Balochistan are essentially unsampled. Whatever picture we are building, it is built from the edges, not the center. Others question whether the Zagros Levant divergence date of 46 to 77,000 years might be inflated by model assumptions. Admixture modeling is sensitive to reference populations, and we still lack ancient genomes from the critical period between 30,000 and 15,000 years ago in this region. The true divergence could be somewhat more recent, but even the most conservative estimates place it deep in the Paleolithic, long before farming was a concept anyone had. And then there is the wild card, the exposed Arabo-Persian Gulf. During the last ice age, when sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today, the Gulf was dry land, a vast lowland plain that could have served as a migration corridor between the Arabian Peninsula and Iran. If populations moved through that corridor before it flooded, the simple mountain barrier model gets more complicated. Some gene flow almost certainly occurred. The question is how much, and whether it was enough to blur the boundary. Based on current evidence, it was not. I went back and reread the Bruchacki paper 3 times, because one detail kept nagging at me. The Zagros Neolithic woman from Ganj Dareh shows her closest modern genetic affinity not to her geographic neighbors in Iraq or the Gulf states, but to Iranian Zoroastrians, Pakistanis, and Afghans. The people she most resembles today are not those who live nearest to her burial site. They are those who inherited her specific ancestral line, regardless of where modern borders fell. A lot of you in the comments have been asking about genetic continuity in the Middle East, whether ancient populations still map onto modern ones. This is one of the clearest cases in the world where the answer is yes. And the reason is geography. The Zagros Wall. The desert moat. These are not metaphors. They are the physical mechanisms that preserved a split older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than any monument standing on Earth today. So here is where we end. Somewhere in the Zagros foothills, 10,000 years ago, a woman herded goats, ground grain, and lived her life without ever knowing that the people farming wheat 300 kilometers to the west were as genetic distant from her as she was from the hunter-gatherers of Ice Age Europe. Her DNA survived in the soil for 100 centuries, and when it finally spoke, it said something the textbooks had missed, that the Middle East was never one family. It was two, living side by side, building civilizations in parallel, connected by trade, by empire, by religion, but never, not once, in 70,000 years, fully merged. If this hidden chapter of human ancestry fascinated you, subscribe and join us for the next one. Because the deeper we dig into ancient DNA, the more borders dissolve, and the more real ones appear. Here is my question for you. If the Zagros Mountains preserved this genetic boundary for 70,000 years, what other genetic boundaries are still hidden behind mountain ranges we have not yet sampled? Let me know what you think in the comments.